All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's Writers Chat. And this is where we like to gather together as writers. And we talk about writing for writers and by writers. And it's lovely to see our community gather together after Thanksgiving. I'm thankful for this community of Writers Chat. So it's great to be together. And we've got a great topic today being led both by Melissa and Johnnie. And we're going to learn something that will help all of us in our storytelling. So I think, Melissa, are you the start? You're going to start first, I think.
I think so.
Okay, we're going to turn it over to you guys and take it away. It's good seeing you guys.
Okay, well, awesome. It's great to see everybody here today and excited that you're joining us. We're going to talk about tropes in fiction today. And I have a feeling that a lot of you probably already know what a trope is, but we're going to kind of touch on that first. Oftentimes, tropes are kind of considered synonymous with cliches. And in fact, when you think of someone referencing a trope in fiction, at least I know I have experienced it. It's often spoken of in this negative context, like, oh, that scene was such a trope. I saw it coming a mile away. But while it's true that tropes can be overused to the point of feeling cliche, that doesn't mean that tropes themselves are bad or that they're necessarily the same thing. So I want to just kind of touch on what a trope is. That a trope is actually a necessity in fiction. So the definition of trope is a word or expression used in a figurative sense. I am sorry, I am really having trouble talking today. My tongue is just not working. So please bear with me. It's like a figure of speech. And of course, in this sense, it's a literary device, like the common or recurring theme. The simplest difference that I can give you as a difference between tropes and cliches is that cliches are undeveloped. So for an example, a cliche would be the dumb jock. Everybody knows the dumb jock, right? It's been used over and over, beaten like the proverbial dead horse. But we can take a dumb jock and turn him into a usable trope. So let's develop that scenario. We have our dumb jock and we're going to make him a trope. Let's say that our dumb jock is in a situation where he has to deliver a package from one scientist to another. Okay, so this package is awful enticing to this dumb jock. He's been instructed to deliver it without issue, but he's looking it over and he decides to open it up, and inside is this elixir, and he decides, I'm going to drink this thing and then fill it up with water and food coloring as a prank and give it to this guy. So he drinks it, and unbeknownst to him, this elixir that he's drank is a revolutionary serum that develops higher brain function. So now our dumb jock, who still did something really dumb, inadvertently begins to develop intellectually. And as the days progress, he goes about his normal routine, but occasionally he spouts off something smart or contrary to his personality. Well, pretty soon he's having moments of moral clarity. Let's say he's like a bully, and so now he's questioning even his bullying of people. Well, all of a sudden we have a usable trope with this dumb jock. So don't be afraid to take even something that seems cliche and turn it into a trope. Just you have to think outside the box. Now we can even take this a step further. Maybe you're thinking it still kind of feels cliche. This trope still feels used. So we'll deepen it by adding yet another trope. And in this case, we'll use the trope prank the prankster. Now we have the scientist in this scenario, right? So this scientist could be the school science teacher. Now the science teacher, maybe he knows that the jock is a bully, and he's seen him doing all this stuff. So he's thinking, I could get even with this guy. And he's also, maybe the science teacher has his own agenda. He wants to be well known for his revolutionary discovery. He's come up with this serum. And so he's decided, well, I still need a test subject to make sure this thing works. So he's decided he's going to trick the jock into drinking the serum. And he gave him the package intentionally, talking about, don't open this thing, get this to my colleague. It's a revolutionary new muscle building energy drink. So now your jock's tempted and he's just got to open this thing and drink it. And maybe the science teacher, you know, doesn't get along with this guy, and he says, well, it could mean my job if you don't get it to him. So that's even more of an enticement for our jock. So then now we see why he did the prank. And we now have a scientist pranking the jock and using him as a guinea pig. And we've got this perfect comedy set up, all using tropes. So this brings me to the topic of genre tropes. Here, maybe I should pause real quick before we jump right into it. Do we have any questions so far or comments?
A few comments. Brandy's mentioned that it's probably why literary fiction is a thing, because people write it who don't like tropes or scripted stories. And then Catherine brought up the Pandora, who can't resist opening the forbidden box.
Yeah, and she touched right on it.
Yeah.
So those who have been paying attention note that I actually use several tropes in this story development to deepen our cliched character. So yeah, I can't.
And very well too.
So like the example I gave you, some tropes can cross genres. Obviously, the example I just gave could be used in a number of different types of novels. You could see that in maybe like YA or in an action adventure type, novel. Tropes become the basic ingredient of your story. That's kind of like your building block that you go on to develop it. So as long as you're using them wisely and thinking outside the box, in this case, we actually used a box, but then you can really come up with some effective tropes. So addressing that, what I just did, I used at least 3 tropes in that scenario. And like Catherine mentioned, Pandora's box was one of them. The package that he just can't resist opening, that is a very common trope in fiction, and it actually crosses many genres. Another one that I used was the ugly duckling trope, which is what we did with our jock. It was kind of a reverse Spider-Man, really. Instead of going from nerd to hero, we went from jock to intellectual nerd. And then, of course, the prank the prankster. So on to genres. There are, like we said, many genres have tropes that can cross genres, but then there are some that are really common to genres. And if you guys can think of some, even spout it out in the chat. Like in romance, for example, we have the damsel in distress. That one's probably one of the more common tropes, like in Rapunzel. Only Johnnie, she'd mentioned earlier, than Tangled, the Disney version. We have the reverse or invert of that one where, Finn is the one in trouble instead of Rapunzel. And then A Marriage of Convenience, that's really common in romance, like 7 Brides for 7 Brothers. We like that one. The Secret Baby. Secret Baby actually is used in a lot of them, including historical fiction. And since I'm a historical fiction writer, I have to throw that in. Some real common historical fiction tropes that I like. Dual timeline, that's probably one of the most popular recently. Historical figures making a cameo appearance in the book, and then like a strong religious figure that shows up either as the moral mentor or as the big bad guy, like think Hunchback of Notre Dame. So then we have fantasy and sci-fi. There's another example of some tropes that we use there. How about the chosen one? Like in Harry Potter, or Luke Skywalker in Star Wars series, or the invaders that take over the world, like in Star Trek, we have the Borg, or the secret heir in fantasy, like in C.S. Lewis' Chronicles of Narnia, the boy and his horse. And then we have mystery. Mystery has some fun tropes. I bet everybody's already thinking of them. You're really intellectual detective like Sherlock Holmes, or the bumbling one like maybe Monk.
Yeah.
With a fetish, that's thrown in a trope in and of itself. There's secret identities or a secret twin. Those can be tropes in mystery. And even an object can become a trope. like we showed, for example, with the Pandora's box. That's a trope, like the talisman trope, maybe like the Cup of Christ in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, or the cursed mummy's tomb in horror. That's a trope. And we've already touched on Pandora's box, so I guess I don't need to touch on that one again. But did anybody else come up with some good tropes in the chat?
Pam mentioned the triangle as far as romance is concerned. So that's a really common one. One you need to be a little bit careful with, not to make that third person very unlikable, which is a tendency newer writers have, because you don't want them to be so unlikable that you wonder why the hero liked that person to begin with, or the opposite.
Yeah.
And Chosen One, she mentioned that too. Love Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. Yes. And then Jeannie has a question. Does a writer first decide which trope to use before writing the story, or as the story develops, use this tool to deepen or expand the story? That is a good question. And I don't think there's probably an easy answer to that question.
No, I think it really depends on the author themselves. I mean, sometimes, half of the time, I think the tropes are a subconscious thing we do, especially, you know, the longer you've been reading and writing, you're familiar with the literary tropes, at least on a subconscious level. Half the time, people don't even realize they're using a trope until it's brought to their attention. Like, oh, yeah, because we're acclimated to it. So sometimes you go at it with a certain trope in mind because it, you know, inspiration strikes and you got that spark. And other times they just kind of tumble out, I think. But that's my perspective.
Let me say too that writing romance, which I tend to write a lot of, and you do have to go into it knowing with that couple what the trope is going to be, because it's going to be a trope. It's going to be either they were enemies and now they're by the end of the story, they're going to be a couple. They're strangers, they're friends, you know, it's got to be at least, they've got to have had some kind of relationship or not a relationship at all. And so any of those is considered actually a trope. So you're going to have to choose one, and which one are you going to choose to tell your story? And then, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but just very briefly, love at first sight is a trope, or is it going to take a long, long time? You know, so there's that. So those are some decisions that you have to make kind of at the beginning when you're writing a romance, at least that kind of thing. Like, how is the relationship going to develop, and what is their relationship at the beginning of the story, or were they strangers?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Good points to make. Oh, the bad guy turned to good guy. That is a very common trope too, or the vice versa. You know, that's a common horror trope too, the reverse of that, where the good guy or the hero turns into the monster. But yeah, the good guy turning to bad guy is especially becoming popular nowadays with your anti-heroes and you know, villains converting. So, well, I think that I have covered most of the topics that I was going to address. And so maybe now would be a good time to kick it over to Johnnie to talk about building on those.
Leslie said readers expect tropes to happen, and that's true. And that's something I'm going to talk about just for a minute as well. So I'm going to try to share my screen. You guys know I always have trouble when I'm trying to share my screen. And because the thing will not move so that I can actually start the slides. The top menu won't move. And it's like, please move there. Oops, it started to move, and then I moved my cursor too soon. There we go. So I'm going to go off screen. I'm going to do that, and we're going to slideshow and play from the start. Okay, Tropes in Fiction Part 2. Here we go. Pablo Picasso said, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. I absolutely love this quote. And it's so important when you're talking about tropes, because you cannot avoid having tropes in your writing. So in some genres, there are required tropes, like in trade romance, happily ever after. is a required trope, like any love inspired, any of the ones I've written for Regal or Tyndale or anybody, Barber, they all expect that. Readers expect that. I will say, Melissa, I don't have the chat on now, so you're going to have to just interrupt me if there's anything, and feel
Sure.
free to do that. Mystery, suspense, and in fact, I'm going to ask, because these are, I put down the ones I'm familiar with. I know romance, and I know like cozy mysteries. I don't know sci-fi. I don't know fantasy that well. I've written some historicals, but I really couldn't come up with a required trope. But if that is your genre, one of those that I've not touched on here is your genre, and you know that there's like what we would call required trope, it's got to be there. Put that in the chat so we can, share that. So mystery suspense, the reader is going to expect that the villain faces judgment and the world will be saved. Women's fiction, I've really not written anything I would consider women's fiction, at least too much. Not anything really in depth, but I think that one required trope in that is that the protagonist, the point of view character, has to gain important insight throughout the course of the story. That's what it's about. It's more character development, and it's a lesson learned. So are there any comments about that?
Was gonna say, I don't know about women's fiction. I was just thinking about your comment about fantasy tropes, and one that occurred to me is also kind of common in historical fiction too, is that epic final battles or extreme political upheaval is oftentimes really common in that, some disturbing force that has to be addressed.
I like that. That's good. Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so those are some required tropes. So now I did put this for fantasy, and I don't think it's really required, but if it's a quest fantasy, it's going to be required that the quest has to be fulfilled. And I think what's really cool about this, and one reason I wanted to put it in here, is the reader expectation is that the quest will be successful. And Tolkien, who's considered the father of fantasy, really, by just about everybody, in the first huge fantasy quest novel trilogy, subverts this trope because the hero, if you consider Frodo the hero, I know there are people who argue about that he's not really, he doesn't really fulfill the quest that's given to him. It sort of happens by accident in a way. So it's so cool to me that even when you've got Tolkien, who sort of has set a lot of ground rules for the fantasy that has come from Lord of the Rings, subverts it right off by not having Frodo actually be the one who throws the ring into the fire, which was his quest. And in another way too, it was a reverse quest, because usually the quest is to go get something. And in this case, it was to go get rid of something, which again was subverting that trope. Okay, so here's some advice from an article in Medium, and I have all this on the resources with the links so that you can go to these quotes yourselves and see the context of them and all of that. Advice: in general, avoid using tropes that have too much in common with other works, characters, and authors. If yours do, perhaps you need to go back to the drawing board and try and inject some new life into an old cliche, which is really what Melissa did so brilliantly with her example of the dumb jock and that whole story. So that means, of course, to follow that advice, you have to be able to recognize the tired tropes. Sometimes you'll find an overused story idea for a specific trope. For example, in romance, there are enemies to lovers or forced together in confined space tropes. For example, all the hotel rooms are booked but one, so they have to share that room, and that can cause tension, and that can cause, in a comedy, it can cause some humorous moments. But you have to, if that's what you want to do, you need to come up with a way that it's different. So maybe it's a tent instead, or, they're camping or whatever. You have to come up with different ways to energize these tropes that could be too tired. There are people who love enemy to lover tropes. There are people who hate them. So, you're going to find your reader base kind of on what tropes you use. We're going to touch on that a little bit more in a minute too.
I love that expression, tired tropes. It's a good way to reference.
Tired ones. So yeah, those are the tired ones. And then we have cliched ones, which Melissa talked about a little bit. So with the trade romance, one very cliched trope is love at first sight. And I will tell you that I have just written within the last couple months, finished a novel and a novella that were both pretty much love at first sight, but I will tell you, editors hate them. And you have to really be careful when you're writing them, because people just don't buy it. They, the whole love at first sight thing. So I got by with the one by having at some point in the story where this woman it's not really love at first sight, but it's really quick, and they don't like the characters to fall in love too quickly. But the story only takes place over a span of like 2 weeks. So it's like, what are you going to do? You have to have that happily ever after. So it's got to happen fast. So at one point when the protagonist is like saying, I don't understand how I can feel this way about somebody I've just met and how strong it is. And these are characters who are in their like late 30s, early 40s. So they're more mature characters too. And her cousin says, I don't know why you don't believe it. Our moms, who were sisters, both had love at first sight stories, and they've been happily married to their husbands all these years and have made it through all the ups and downs and the joys and heartaches, of marriage. So why do you think it happened to them? Why couldn't it happen to you? So it's just kind of addressing it just head on. And so people that are reading it saying, yeah, they're falling in love too fast. It's kind of like, well, look, you know what? Sometimes it does happen and it works out.
Mm-hmm.
Another cliche trope in mystery and suspense is the defective detective. And that, of course, goes all the way back to like Sam Spade and, is it Mike Hammer? I forget. But those guys, those hard-boiled detectives who were alcoholics, who, just really, what I want to say, just beaten up by the world kind of people, and yet brilliant in doing the detective. So if you're going to do something like that, and we see it a lot now too, a lot of, as we scroll through Prime or Netflix, there's all these detective stories, and so many of them, it's the detective with the past. And of course, every detective has a past, but it's like always a really tragic past, and they're never happily married. They're always out of a relationship. And it's just like, can't we have anybody that's just kind of normal and be a detective? And so last night I was going through and I saw a show, I didn't stop and watch it, but it was Sister Boniface. And she's a nun who makes wine and rides a motorcycle. Well, how much more fun is that than another detective who's mad at the world and has a chip on his shoulder?
That's another common trope that stems back from historical fiction too. One of the common things I've seen is like using the monk or the sister as the detective that discovers things. And they've come up with some pretty creative versions of that too.
Well, yeah, because you told me one, and I actually bought the first book in the series, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. Now I don't remember her name, but I think of her every time I see this Sister Boniface. So is it the same name, just brought up to date?
Sister Fidelma is Peter Tremaine's series. But yeah, there's also, I don't know if I'm saying it right because it's Welsh, but I think it's like Brother Cadfael or something like that. There we go. Somebody else, Catherine Swartz mentioned it in the chat, the Cadfael fan. Yeah, it's a real common one. I like those.
Father Brown. That's
yes.
Yeah. So yeah, there are some of those too. And then the bumbling Southern sheriff, which is just not, that's not just cliche. That's so stereotypical. It's not even funny. Yeah. So let's not even try to do that one. Do something very, very different. Fantasy. We mentioned that. and when Melissa was giving her part of the presentation, and we're going to come back to that one in a little bit and talk about Harry Potter being the chosen one. So again, you have to know the trope to be able to break the trope. And I use break meaning, you know, to subvert it or turn it on its head or change it. I love that Melissa talked about Entangled, because yes, in that story, she ends up, I mean, he saves her in a way, but she's the one who actually saves his life, right? She saves Finn's life. And it's one of my very favorite animated stories. That and Anastasia. I love them both. Can watch them over and over and over again.
Entangled's my favorite too.
It's so good. Okay, so when a trope is used cleverly or subverted in an unexpected way, it showcases the writer's mastery of the genre. When used as a crutch, a trope demonstrates lazy writing and a lack of originality. The best way to learn to use tropes artfully is to develop a deep familiarity with your genre, whether it's sci-fi, thriller, fantasy, or romance. If you study the conventions of that genre, you'll be better equipped to use its tropes to surprise and delight your readers. And that goes back to the Pablo Picasso quote, you know, you have to, you know the rules and then be able to break them like an artist. Okay, so using tropes. So we really are hammering this. Research the tropes for your genre, and you do that by reading books in your genre, being very familiar with what's out there, what's being overdone, what's not being done enough, and how you can turn things on its head. And I will tell you, Love Inspired, they are still, you would think that all the secret baby stories would have been told in the world, but nope, they still want them. So you just have to come up with new ways for those babies to be secret. So research the tropes, choose your favorites, and then brainstorm ways to use those tropes in your story. Transforming tropes. What is the secret? It's character development. I don't have a quote for this, but I read this in a lot when I was researching this topic, came across this in a lot of different articles. Again and again, they talked about you want to really transform a trope, develop your characters, know your characters. And we actually saw Melissa do this when she was telling us about the dumb jock, and then it just developed, right? It was then he became kind of smart and he started thinking about, oh, I used to be a bully, but now I sort of understand how that wasn't a good thing. So we see a little bit of a character arc there. Mm-hmm. So you really have to know your characters. I think it was Eva Marie Everson who, and I was not there, so this story was told to me at a writer's conference, stood on stage and asked everyone to raise their hand who had like an engagement story, a proposal story. And of course, a lot of people raised their hands. And she said, look how many of you there are, but I guarantee you all your stories are different. And that's true. So like even in a romance, we think we tell them all, but it's the characters that make them unique. So the reader knows that the characters are going to get together at the end, that there's going to be that happily ever after. So they know that. They read the book for the how. How is it going to happen? Same thing with a mystery. They know that the villain's going to be caught and be brought to justice. So they're not reading it for that. They're reading it for the how. How is that going to happen? How is the crime going to be solved? So you really, 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 really need to be developing your characters. Okay, let's talk about the chosen one. I read more than once that this is an overused trope and people are sick of it. And yet it's such a common one. And I think it does come down to everyone wants to be that person who made a difference in the world, right? We all want to think that we made a difference in at least our little corner of the world. And so we really love reading about these tropes of these people who were chosen to do a specific job and did that job, that quest, that task, despite all these odds. So this was on Quora. Did J.K. Rowling successfully upend the cliched chosen one trope? So these are selected quotes from Mimi at 235, who was answering this question. Harry Potter as the chosen one is not a solution to a problem, but a key to open the door. And because that is capitalized, I have a feeling that's part of the hero's journey, maybe, or something like that, so that people as a group could find a solution. Albus Dumbledore, who's the head wizard, the headmaster at Hogwarts, says to a couple of the other characters, Harry is our best chance, trust him. Mimi says Harry is not the only chance, but he is the best one. But Harry himself doesn't work as a solitary weapon. The chosen one is indivisible from the golden trio. And I think this is really cool, the way she has brought this together, this analysis. Harry is special because he's selfless and he's brave and he's willing to sacrifice. And she calls that he's the soul of the golden trio. Hermione is special because of her understanding and her preparedness, how she can guide the trio to do what needs to be done. So she's the mind. And Ron is special because of his generosity and acceptance and his family. And so he's the heart. So it took all three of them together to actually fulfill what needed to be done. The golden trio. It's the same for every character. And she does talk about Voldemort also being special in a way, and I didn't include all that, but I thought this part was important, that they match in opposition. And we know that that needs to happen no matter what you're writing. If you're writing a mystery, suspense, the hero has to be, or the villain has to be as strong as the hero, sometimes even stronger. Sherlock Holmes needed a Moriarty, right? So they need to be matched. You need to know that that final battle is not going to be just one-sided. Magic and power is secondary to the mental and emotional journey the characters undergo. So there again, we have character development. Character development is more important than the magic and power, which is part of the story and part of the plot. But this mental and emotional journey is more important than that. Because Harry Potter is not about the triumph of physical brute force of individuals because they are especially powerful. It's about human weakness and fallibility. Harry chose to fight Voldemort regardless of the prophecy. And while the magic is fun and Dumbledore versus Voldemort duel was impressive, the story isn't about that really. It's about being a better person. Now, if you're not familiar with the story, this will not make sense to you, but this is the way it unfolded over all the books and the movies. Severus never saw battle, but he died a better man. Dumbledore didn't die in a duel. He sacrificed his life. Grindelwald chose to die. He took his secrets to his grave. And Fred and Sirius died laughing like they best lived. Harry walked to his death, which means he accepted that he had little control over Voldemort actions, but he controlled his own. He had little control over Voldemort's fate, but he could control his. And by doing so, he unlocked a power that was needed. He understood his strength and his enemy's weakness, and by doing so, he vanquished Lord Voldemort, the man. So her conclusion is, yes, JKR did the chosen one trope wonderfully. So maybe that, especially if you're familiar with the stories, gives you an idea of how you can take a very common trope and just with character development and a lot of plot twists, you can really, really make it different and wonderful. Now, I will say that the chosen one trope is popular and has become unpopular because of the popularity of Harry Potter, right? I mean, those books just took everybody by storm. And so everyone was writing chosen one tropes, and it's just become a little bit too much. But things, come around and go around. So there may be a little bit of time now where the chosen one trope is ignored and not used, But if that's a story that you have that you want to tell, it's very likely that that cycle will come back around. Just like in history, World War II is very popular, then it's not, then it is again. Civil War is popular, it's not, then it is again. So there is just a cycle to these things.
I would also comment that J.K. Rowling used 2 tropes with Harry Potter to automatically make him relatable. Apart from being the chosen one, he was also the underdog.
Yeah.
So right off the bat, you related to him because you sympathized with him in his horrible state. And so you wanted to see something better happen for Harry all through it, and you're rooting for him just because of that. And quite frankly, a lot of people love the underdog trope, and that's another big pull with Harry Potter.
Yeah. There again, that's a trope that appeals to people because we often all feel like underdogs, really. And, and it's helpful for children to read those stories where an underdog has been successful because they can feel very powerless. And so it teaches them that, maybe they have more power than they think they do to face whatever's going on in their lives, we could go on and on with this. I'll say too, he's an orphan. So was Luke Skywalker. They were both orphans, both living with their aunts and uncles. Both were taught both had special powers they did not know they had, and then were taught by somebody. So there again, you've got 2 very completely different stories, but they had the very same premise. There is a skit, I think it's a Saturday Night Live skit, where J.K. Rowling and George Lucas both go into the plot store and say, I want a story about an orphan, what I just said. And then the other one says, oh, that sounds good. Give me one of those too. So you can start out with the same premise and come up with 2 very, very, very different stories. Okay, now we're going to do a quick little rabbit trail. I can't see the time, so we're good. Of the Golden Trio, I actually did a class similar to this. I guess it was more about character. It was more about characters and protagonists and deuterogonists and protagonists and all this kind of thing for the Serious Writer Fiction Club. And this came up in that. So I kind of took that slide and moved it over here. And the Harry Potter was part of it at that time. So there were 4 instead of 3 with Hermione and Ron and Harry. So here you see the Golden Trio in some other stories. In Star Wars, it's Luke and Leia and Han. And I tried to go so far as to think about the whole soul, mind, heart thing. And, so I'm not saying that necessarily always translates to every set of 3 characters, but, it's kind of fun to think about. I think Leia is probably the mind, Luke the soul, and Han the heart, even though you might not think so at first, but he is the one that came back. And, so he did have a heart for the rebellion and for Leia. Star Trek, the original series, is Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy. So, of course, Mr. Spock, definitely the mind. Again, Kirk is the main character, probably the soul, and Dr. McCoy is the doctor, the physician, the heart. I don't know about Woody, Buzz, and Jessie in Toy Story 2, but it gets another great example of a trio. It's been a long time since I've seen that story. So it may be that that's what you want to do in your story, is to have this golden trio, a set of 3 characters who are kind of working together, sometimes at odds with each other, sometimes acting as foils with each other, sometimes maybe causing more problems than they're solving for each other. And yet at the bottom line, when things are bleak, working together to resolve whatever the situation is and reach that climax together and go through it. So there you go, little rabbit trail. Just very quick, tropes in marketing. And of course, this is mostly helpful if you're indie publishing, but you can use your stories tropes in the keywords for your book, like on Amazon, or when you're writing like blog posts or something about it, you could, make sure that you are paying attention to search engine optimization with your keywords. You can also use the trope in the title or subtitle of your book. For example, say your book is called Love Surprise. You could title it Love Surprise, a second chance romance. You know, so you could do that kind of a thing right there on the Amazon page. Clearly communicating the tropes that are present in your story is a great way to express what readers can expect from your book and can help you get it into the hands of the right audience. So don't be afraid to talk about the tropes in your book or to recognize that they're there, because they are there. And if you know them and you have used them purposefully, you can also then use them in your marketing. Even if you're traditionally published, you can still figure out ways to share that this is the kind of story it is. Like if it's a enemies to lovers romance, make sure that that's on your Instagram and Pinterest and tweets and all those kinds of things, that you're letting readers know that this is the kind of story it is. Okay, this is going a little bit deep, and since I wasn't sure how much time we'd have, so since we do have a little bit of time, I'm just going to go through this pretty quick, but I'm not going to read all of this. I'm almost positive I have talked about the site TV Tropes before on here. If you go there and you put in your favorite movie, your favorite book, it will give you all kinds of tropes that are used in that story, more than you probably ever dreamed were possible. So I pulled a few tropes that specifically refer to C.S. Lewis's book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So I'm just going to give you a glimpse into this and how these tropes work. One of them is arbitrary skepticism. So we all know when Lucy first comes to Narnia, she has walked inside of a wardrobe, outside of that wardrobe into a forest, and that doesn't really seem to bother her, but then she wonders why there's a street light in the middle of the forest. So that's arbitrary skepticism. She's not skeptical of everything that's going on, just this one thing, the light. So that's kind of a fun thing. CHEKHOV'S gun. I know that you all have seen this quote before. If you've been in writing very long at all, if you say in the first chapter that there is a rifle hanging on the wall, that gun must go off. Now, this is in the second or third chapter. Really what this is, it was a play, and it said, if there's a gun hanging on the wall in the first act, it better go off by the third act or in the third act. And so I don't think it has to be the second or third chapter necessarily, but it's got to be fired. If you're saying, oh, look at that gun, yeah, something better happen with that gun. In the TV Tropes article, they're saying that Lucy's handkerchief acted as CHEKHOV'S gun. She gives it to Tumnus, the fawn, as a parting gift after her first trip to Narnia. Later, he gives it to the beavers on getting wind of his arrest, and then they give it to the children when they come back to Narnia again. And so Lucy is convinced that the beavers will help her and her siblings. So that builds trust, right? And so that's important too, that this object and this act is what helps them know that they can trust these beavers in this very strange land. So CHEKHOV'S gun is an insignificant object that later turns out to be important. Non-sequitur environment. So this is one of the most famous examples of this trope, because it's discovered that the wardrobe is actually a portal door. And so as Lucy goes through the wardrobe, she finds herself in the land of Narnia. So whether you're walking, swimming, flying, or using some more exotic mode of transportation, the transition from one environment to another generally makes basic logical sense. So it becomes all the more noticeable when someone abruptly transitions into a completely different environment that doesn't connect with the area leading up to it, and no rational explanation is immediately forthcoming. The Scottish trope. So you probably have heard this too, that the title of a certain play by Shakespeare is called the Scottish play because actors and actresses don't think you should say the word Macbeth except in character rehearsals. Otherwise, you're creating bad luck. The play will be ruined. The troupe, the theater may be cursed. So you just aren't allowed to say it. It's a basic and common superstition. Some words are not spoken. So in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the White Witch forbids her dwarf and Edmund from saying Aslan's name under threat of instant death. And of course, we also see this in Harry Potter. Voldemort, he who must not be named, right? That's the Scottish trope. So final thoughts. When we go to a bookstore and look around, it might truly feel as if there is nothing new under the sun. This is because of tropes. Coming up with fresh, rarely used ideas is difficult and often unpopular. Publishers don't generally want to take the risk of publishing something that's too new or too different. They want something predictable. Making something completely original may only cater to a niche market. If you want to reach the maximum amount of people with your novel, appealing to only a small amount of the market share is a risky choice to take. So you do have to sort of think about what you want to do, what you want your writing to be. And I will tell you, even if you want to avoid tropes, you're not going to be able to. So you need to decide which ones you want to use and use them well. Final thought. Tropes are popular for a reason. People like them. Readers like them. Here's the resources. I'm going to post this entire PowerPoint presentation in the Writers Chat Facebook group. The name just completely went on my head there for a minute. So that you can go through it again, look at it again, read those, go back, look at the resources if you want to study this anymore. So what did I miss in the chapter?
I was scrolling back up.
A trope thesaurus. I didn't know about that. That's pretty cool.
I just heard about it last week when I got the newsletter from Joanna Penn, and she interviewed the author of the Tropes thesaurus. She was doing a podcast on tropes, and I guess she's written 3 of them. There's the basic Tropes thesaurus, and then she has one on romance tropes and horror tropes. So might be worth checking out.
That sounds like a Christmas idea for those of you that want to get into it. Put on your list really quick. They can get it probably and wrap it up for Christmas for you. I think that's great. You know, Johnnie and Melissa, this is fascinating. You know, I'm not a fiction writer. And so, I loved your illustration because I did read Harry Potter and I did read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So your illustrations were dynamic. And, you know, I never really thought about the golden trio. I'm also thinking sometimes it could be a duo too, couldn't it? Not Superman, Robin and Batman. There was somebody what was the other one I was thinking of? Oh, Frodo and Sam.
Even the Matrix, you have Trinity and Neo.
Yeah, so even
very common. Yeah.
And I was going to say that example, sometimes duos will eventually include a trio too, like Christian mentioned, the Matrix. You also kind of have to throw Morpheus in there every now and again too.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
You need that because you got your hero, but you need somebody that they can confide in. You need somebody to be a foil to them who maybe is stronger in one area. So you see the difference between the weakness and that, or to challenge them, but they're not the villain, but they need someone to challenge them sometimes. So it's very interesting just to really get into these different roles that you need to have. So even say you think, I'm just going to write a simple romance. Right away, think of the characters you need. You need the hero, the heroine. They both have to have a friend. You've got 4 characters right there. And you haven't even gotten into who's going to be working against them. So, you build a cast pretty quickly that way.
It just shows you the importance of this character development, and we've talked about character development a little bit before on some of our shows. Pam made the comment that the number 3 needs to be more likable, but then she says in the Lord of the Rings you have Sam, Frodo, and Gollum, and so you do have 3. I just think it's interesting. It's be fun to go back and visit some of these stories, looking for those.
Yes, yeah. Carrie asked about suspending belief. And, she said, is the whole wood, not surprising Lucy, what they call, it's actually suspension of disbelief. Isn't that what the term is? And I don't know, but it's more the reader has to suspend your belief. When you're walking into this, you're saying that you believe this is happening, even though it's not possible, so it has to be told in such a realistic way that you're believing it and you're willing to go along with that journey, even though you know that there is no such thing as, unfortunately,
you both are experienced in fiction, in different genres, but very experienced in fiction. Me, I'm not. I find this in a little bit discouraging, overwhelming. Like, how could I write a decent story? You know what I mean? So I'm thinking the thesaurus might be a good place to start. But so I'll go back to my original question. If for a beginner, maybe would it be better to decide that trope would do kind of like what Melissa does, try to take it to some unique ways to develop a story? Or what do you think? What's your suggestion for new fiction writers?
I think Johnnie really hit on it. The whole what they hammer for writers anyway is to start immersing yourself in what you're wanting to pursue. Read and read often. I mean, what is it that sparks your interest? So obviously, if you're inspired to write fiction, you've already probably got an idea brewing in your head. You've already got the story idea. So then you've probably read books that sparked it anyway. I would say keep exploring that, feed that inspiration, and look for the books in the genre that you want to write in, and you'll suddenly just start becoming immersed with all those tropes. They will become second nature. Like I said, a lot of times you're writing tropes and you don't even realize it, because from childhood you've heard stories, you've had them read to you, and you've read them, and so they just come naturally. But that's my thought.
I think that's true too, and it's intuitive. Like I know that in my first however many books, I wasn't thinking, oh, what are the tropes? I wasn't thinking about that at all. It's only been in the last couple of years that I've become really interested in tropes and in talking about them and teaching about them. So I don't think you need to. I think you can, if you're well read, you've read a lot. I think that you can just kind of trust your instincts on that. And then as you get, and at least write your draft. And then as you get more into it, you maybe think, okay, now what do I need to do? What do I need to strengthen? What am I doing that's been done too much? And how can I make this a little different? And again, some things you can't, because I don't want to just keep beating this, but like with a romance, you've got two characters. They had a relationship ahead of time. Those number of relationships are limited. There's only so many things they could have been. So you're starting out with something already that has been done a zillion times, but your characters are unique, and how they interact with each other is unique because they're unique. So that's what you really want to work on, is just making sure you've got these characters who are well-rounded and you allow them to be themselves. And I know sometimes for people who don't write fiction, that sounds crazy, but characters do become their own people if they make their own decisions sometimes.
Yes.
Well, beginner writers, they often err on the side of writing only tropes, and usually it comes out as the well-worn, tired tropes that they're familiar with. And as they grow and mature and learn their skill and craft, then they begin to make the tropes more unique. So I think as a new writer, it's natural to start writing tropes, and the challenge is how to make them unique and interesting. I do know that there are some writers out there that will go looking purposefully for tropes to mash them together, twist them, and make something new, because they find it an interesting challenge. So for some writers, that's what they want to do. They want to figure out, how can I do something? And some writers just love doing that, and that's what they write. And then others, they just go about and they write because I think instinctively we all have a tendency to understand a basic story. Now I have to say, I was not one of those that automatically understood. I had to learn it. tell a story. But tropes are in there. I knew the basic tropes because we just hear them all the time. So I think they naturally come out.
I
Yeah,
think that's a good point.
very good point. And that's good discussion. It's a good discussion. Hey, it's about noon. While we still got the recording going, just tell you what next week's Writers Chat's going to be. It's how to use BookPub and Book Funnel. And I believe we have a guest. I can't remember who was going to be there, but I think Bethany's our contact. So hopefully Bethany will join us next week.
It's going to be Jenna Trump from
Jenna-
Freedom Publishing.
There it
I
is.
think I said her name right. I hope I did.
I could remember who it was, but she'll be with us. But BookPub is quite a big thing growing right now. A lot of people are getting some good marketing with that.
Yeah.
So if you're
I
familiar
love
with that,
that.
this will give us some good info. I'm not as familiar with Book Funnel, so I'm looking forward to that. On that. And thank you, you two. Thank you. Brandy, do you have
Bye.
anything else to say in conclusion too? Just no?
No, you guys did a fantastic job covering tropes. It's great. And actually, we're so good at writing tropes that sometimes we don't know that we're writing them. So it's good to
That's
look at them
true.
more and learn more about them and how to just twist them up and change them. So
That's
I'll
why-
probably go back and listen to this again.
Yeah, if you go to that TV tropes, I mean, things that you don't even think are tropes are tropes. I mean, it's incredible to go through that and just start reading, and it's like
Nothing new under the sun, right?
not at all, not at all. So it is fun to see how they talk.
And of the making of many books, there is no end
right.
until Jesus comes.
Amen on that. Well, that's a good thing to end on, Brandy. I think. Thank you again for joining us today for Writers Chat. We thank you for taking the time to watch the replay. I think
Yes.
Brandy hit the nail on the head. This is one we might want to go back and listen to more than often. Thank you for Johnnie for posting it into our
Yeah.
Writers Chat members page a little bit later this afternoon. And Melissa, thank you for that great illustration to start where you expanded that. That was the perfect way to start. It's been great info. And we invite those of you that are in the chat to stay around with us for a few minutes for the after party. And we'll see you next week on Writers Chat.
Jean, you may not have seen my post, but I had asked what time that you'll be posting PowerPoint.
I could not hear her. Could you hear her? See what? See her post?
Yes, I had asked what time you will be posting the PowerPoint.
It'll be up there really soon. Yeah, I answered. It'll be up there probably as soon as we get off of here.
I thought Johnnie had replied
Yeah.
to you. But she'll get it up sometime this afternoon.
It'll be up pretty quick. Okay.
Thank you.
You're
We'll
welcome.
get- Yeah, we're glad to share. Okay, bye everybody. We'll see you next week on Writers Chat. Bye-bye.